partnership the library has with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, who work hard to find knowledgeable speakers month after month. So I invite Carol from the Saskatoon Environmental Society to come up and introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Megan. I am a volunteer with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. The Environmental Society, which we abbreviate SES, has worked on environmental issues in the province for over 50 years. These issues include energy and climate solutions, water protection, biodiversity preservation, and reduction of toxic substances. We invite you to become a member of the Environmental Society. The Saskatchewan Environmental Society's newsletter, The Environmental Resource, has information on the ways the Society is working towards a world in which all needs can be met in sustainable ways. You can sign up to receive the newsletter at the website environmentalsociety.ca. Our speaker this evening is Peter Prebble. Peter has been involved in work of SES for over 30 years. He served as a member of the Legislature of Saskatchewan for 16 years. And Peter has been the Director of Environmental Policy at SES and President of the SES Solar Cooperative, the first renewable power cooperative in Saskatchewan. Peter holds a Bachelor of Business Administration from the University of Prince Edward Island and master's degrees in Education and Sustainable Environmental Management from the University of Saskatchewan. The title of Peter's presentation is How Should Saskatchewan Respond to 3 Global Threats We Face: the climate emergency, the escalation of nuclear weapons, and the loss of biodiversity in the world.
Thank you very much for coming out on a day when you could be having supper. With the library needing to close at 8 now, the Sustainable Speaker Series is starting at 6 instead of 7. And I realize that's not the greatest in terms of getting a full meal before you come. Thank you for coming. And I want to apologize that I had a PowerPoint presentation that I spent a few days putting together. And you all know what it's like to have technical problems with your computer, and I've downloaded a couple of hundred PowerPoint presentations in my day onto memory sticks, and I could not get this one onto a memory stick by the life of me, for a reason that I don't understand. So I don't have it with me tonight, but so I'm just going to speak without any visual aids. Anyway, I really appreciate you being here, and I want to start by talking a little bit about the biodiversity crisis in the world and what Saskatchewan's role should be, in my own opinion, in terms of responding to it. The World Wildlife Fund has put out a couple of reports, one actually just in the last 2 days with respect to Canada, but a global one last year looking at the state of wildlife in the world. So this is just wildlife. Which it's basically saying has declined by 73% since 1970 at a global level. So we really do face a biodiversity crisis in that context. In Canada, the numbers are not nearly as alarming, but they're still concerning. Overall wildlife on average has declined by about 10%. But that figure is misleading. It's just an average. You know, some species are increasing in numbers, others are declining. For instance, in Saskatchewan, there's been a 62% decline in grassland species. So that's not just Saskatchewan, but it's Manitoba and Alberta as well. But a 62% decline, a 67% decline in Saskatchewan in our bird population in the grasslands. So this is the kind of concern that we really do need to address. And one of the best ways of addressing it, in my opinion, is to increase our protected areas in the province of Saskatchewan. Many of you will know that the federal government has set a target of 30% of Canada's lands being protected by the year 2030 with formal protection. And the federal government has been moving forward on that quite ambitiously in the territories, and it's also moving towards an aggressive target in the oceans. But of course, to do it within the provinces requires the cooperation of the provincial government. And in our case in Saskatchewan, that cooperation doesn't exist. The province's target is a 12% of Saskatchewan's lands and waters being protected. We're currently at about 9.8%. So Saskatchewan's government doesn't see a very significant growth in protected areas under its current policy. And in my opinion, that needs to change. Saskatchewan should be setting the same target that the international community has set, 30% of all lands and waters to be protected. And you know, really it's only British Columbia and Quebec that are giving the federal government real cooperation in terms of meeting this target. But it's something that I think we should urge the government of Saskatchewan to get serious about. And it's only if we do that, for instance, that we could be looking at, there's no protection on the Cumberland Delta, if you can imagine, the biggest inland delta, you know, in North America. There's no protection in some areas of the Nisbet Forest that Aboriginal people are very, very anxious to see preserved. There's been a campaign in recent months that I've been part of to get the government of Saskatchewan to stop logging in the northwest part of the Nisbet, which is a very beautiful part of the forest. Métis Local 66, Sturgeon Lake First Nation have been urging the government to embark on that, and a number of non-Aboriginal people have worked to support them, including the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. And the government has just declared a 2-year moratorium on logging in an area that they were going to log immediately while ongoing discussions take place. But you know, for there to be real reconciliation, and I've learned this from the Métis and from Sturgeon Lake First Nation, if we're going to have real reconciliation with Aboriginal people, we have to make sure they have access to the land so that those who want to can continue their traditional activities. And without that land access, you know, reconciliation is going to be quite empty for a lot of those people. So it's important that we prioritize that. The whole southern part of the Great Sandhills needs protection. The provincial government originally back in 2006 had a plan to protect 36 protected areas in the Great Sandhills, the southern part of the Great Sandhills. But when the government changed, that whole plan for protection was dropped. So it's another area where, for instance, that's such an important area for grassland species, and it basically remains unprotected at this point in time. So enough said about what I think Saskatchewan should be doing on the biodiversity front. I think there's a lot we could do, for instance, and talk about in terms of restoring ecosystems. But I think above all, having a much larger protected network across the province is really important. I want to talk about the nuclear weapons threat for a moment. And you know, what we do here is complicated, and you may not agree with what I'm suggesting, but I want to throw it out for discussion. It's always seemed to me that the biggest problem with uranium mining in Saskatchewan has been the connection to the nuclear weapons industry. And obviously a lot of our uranium is going for civilian purposes. But that connection has been very real right from the outset. The only reason that Uranium City and the Gunner Mine on the north shore of Lake Athabasca, which was developed in the 1960s, the only reason those mines were ever developed was for atomic weapons purposes. The federal government bought up all that uranium and it sold it to the U.S. Atomic Energy Agency. And several other little, much smaller mines in the Uranium City area were also developed strictly for atomic weapons purposes. And that's a well-established fact that I think most Saskatchewan younger people particularly don't realize has been the case. And then of course, as the nuclear power industry developed in the 70s and 80s, you know, some of the mine, well, particularly the Uranium City mine began to be used primarily for shipping for civilian purposes, for nuclear electrical generation. And as new mines came online, certainly the majority of the uranium that was sold was for civilian purposes. But this was never completely clear. When the Clough Lake uranium mine, for instance, was being developed in the 1970s and operating in the 80s and 90s, the French government was still testing atomic weapons in the Pacific. And the French government specifically said we will not separate our civilian and military streams of uranium. So it wasn't until France stopped atomic weapons testing in the 90s that at least there wasn't that blatant connection anymore. But the French government continued to insist that, that there would be no separation. And of course, AMOC, who first developed that Clough Lake mine, was a subsidiary of the French Atomic Energy Agency, which ran both a civilian program and a weapons program. That's just one example. You know, we were selling uranium, for instance, to South Korea directly from Saskatchewan. It was a military government that had a nuclear weapons exploitation committee. Same with Argentina. We were selling uranium to Argentina in the 80s when Argentina was being run by a military government that was trying to develop nuclear weapons. So there's been all these connections over the years. And one of the foundations for civilian nuclear trade in the world has always been the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in it came into force in 1970. The signatories were being gathered before that. But under the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty, all the non-nuclear states promised that they would not develop nuclear weapons in exchange for the 5 nuclear weapon states that signed the agreement, promising that they would vigorously pursue nuclear disarmament. That's the provision in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That provision has never been honored by the nuclear weapon states. And every one of them, but not every one of them has expanded their nuclear arsenal, but first of all, some of them have in a significant way kept growing their number of nuclear weapons. And Canada has even gone so far as to enter into an agreement with one of the countries that wouldn't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely India. We've entered into an agreement with them in 2012. I mean, just for a little bit of history here, India exploded an atomic weapon in 1974 using a nuclear power plant that Canada had sold it as a cover for developing its atomic weapons program. And for a while after it did that, Canada cut off selling uranium to India. But then in 2012, after a lot of lobbying from the provincial government, the federal government entered into an agreement with the Indian government that it would sell uranium to them as long as it was being inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure that Saskatchewan's uranium wasn't being used for nuclear weapons. But what this did is it freed up India to use its own uranium for its nuclear weapons. And since we signed that agreement back in 2012, India's nuclear weapons arsenal has doubled. So India now has 172 nuclear weapons, approximately. And it's just an example of how, you know, the agreements that we are entering into really don't mean very much in terms of preventing non-proliferation. So it's my view, and this is controversial, that Saskatchewan should stop selling uranium to every nuclear weapon state until it complies with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6. And it's not likely that those nuclear weapon states will want to comply, in which case we should just stop selling uranium to them. And of course this would put a massive dent into our uranium exports. But you know, unless the Non-Proliferation Treaty is actually enforced, it doesn't mean very much. And of course, some countries argue that, well, if the nuclear weapon states that sign the agreement don't follow it, then why should they? And so you can see the problems that this brings up. Anyway, something to think about, because obviously it's not straightforward. You know, these countries also operate, the nuclear weapon states also operate civilian nuclear power programs, and I'm not in favor of shutting down existing nuclear reactors. I'm not a big fan of building new ones, but in the middle of a climate emergency, I don't think we should shut down the existing ones. But I don't think we should sell to countries that are blatantly violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty and every one of the nuclear weapon states is. Well, the third topic, and perhaps the most important one, the climate emergency, and what we do in the face of the climate emergency. Well, as many of you know, we're now looking at a situation where the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 423 parts per million. It was 280 parts per million pre-industrial. And carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas with an average lifetime in the atmosphere of 100 years. So it's a great concern that we're now sitting at 423 parts per million. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration warned when we reached 400 parts per million, and we're now at 423, that sea levels were 30 feet higher than they are now the last time the world faced a carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere of 400 parts per million. It also pointed out that zebras and horses were living in the high Arctic in those temperatures. In other words, it was a completely different climate from what we have now. And of course, it was a climate that human civilization never experienced. We've now gone well past that point. And we really are conducting a very dangerous experiment in which the future of human civilization, I think, is at stake. Because we're not feeling the full impact of the current concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's not just carbon dioxide that is at an alarmingly high level, it's methane and nitrous oxide, which keep going up every year, largely as a result of the fossil fuel industry, fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel burning. So we're basically creating a situation in which there's a huge risk of climate breakdown. And already we had in 2024, for the first time, we exceeded, just for a single year, but I think we'll keep exceeding this, we exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial that the international scientific community has warned we should not exceed. So we already exceeded it in 2024, but to be above it truly, it would involve, a decade or two of exceedance, not just a single year. But we're heading on down a dangerous road, and the risks are becoming pretty self-evident, and a lot of you here are familiar with them. I'll just touch on maybe three. But one, of course, is drought. And we're seeing evidence of that in Saskatchewan, more intense droughts than we've experienced in recent years. We're increasingly experiencing very dry conditions in parts of the province. And more significantly, we're experiencing that right across the country. In July of this year, more than 70% of all the territory of Canada was under either abnormally dry or drought conditions. So that's something we've not seen before, is extremely dry conditions right across the country, including in Atlantic Canada. So that's a real warning for us. A second warning, and it's not just Canada that's experiencing this, drought conditions are spreading across the globe. It's just that we're experiencing here at home as well. And of course, we're experiencing forest fire seasons that we've never faced before. And in 2023, there were more than 17 million hectares of forest that burned in Canada. And now we're seeing the second worst forest fire season we've ever seen in Canada this year. Already 8.7 million hectares of forest are burned across the country, well above anything else that we've seen in previous years other than 2023. And very significantly, more than 3 million hectares of forest have burned in Saskatchewan this year. It's the worst forest fire season that Saskatchewan has ever seen. And just to put this in context, that area of forest is 130 times the size of the territory occupied by the city of Saskatoon. So we're talking about an enormous amount of forest that is burned in Saskatchewan this year, and the season isn't yet, although it's nearing an end. So this is a very, very worrisome circumstance. And it's another indication of the fact that the boreal forest in Canada and all the communities who live in northern Saskatchewan who suffered evacuation this summer are right on the front lines of the climate emergency at this point in time. And these same kinds of problems are being experienced, of course, in lots of other parts of the globe. The Mediterranean has been on fire for several years now. Really bad wildfires in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in Albania, just to use those countries as examples, in Italy. Firefighters are bravely fighting these fires wherever they occur in the world, but they're getting harder and harder to manage. They're getting more intense. The forest fire seasons are lasting longer. You see that with our neighbors to the south in states like California and Oregon. So we're facing a really dangerous situation in terms of wildfires. And in the same way that the boreal forest is at risk in northern Saskatchewan, coral reef ecosystems are at risk in the tropical parts of the world. Last year and this year, 80% of the world's coral reefs suffered bleaching in some part of the reef. So, we're talking about 82 countries being impacted. There's a lot of people in the world who depend on the coral reefs as a source of food security. Millions and millions of people do. That source of food security is increasingly at risk. And the international scientific community has been warning the world for years that if we allow global average temperature to go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, that most of the coral reefs in the world will perish. At 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial, they are warning that virtually all coral reef ecosystems in the world will die. And we're seeing increasing bleaching in the most important reef in the world, the Great Barrier Reef. It first bleached in 1998, then in 2002, then in 2016, and 2017, and 2020, and then 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. In other words, the reef doesn't get any recovery time anymore. And bleaching, inevitably, if it's for an extensive period of time, leads to coral reef mortality. So we're at risk of losing these reefs, not just having them bleach. So those are there are so many other impacts from climate change, and most of you will be familiar with many of them. But the question, of course, is what to do about it, and what does Canada do about it, what does Saskatchewan do about it. At a national level, I think one of the things that we must continue to insist on is that the federal government do away with all fossil fuel subsidies. All subsidies for the fossil fuel industry should come to an end. It's also really important, and you can see that the federal government is hesitating on this now. It had during the Trudeau years, it had a pretty firm climate change policy. It's slowly winding that down or slowing it down. I'm starting to worry that it could be abandoned to some degree, not completely. I thought that Prime Minister Carney would, having been a UN climate envoy, would actually take the climate emergency very seriously, but there's signs that may not happen. There's a lot of lobbying going on from industry, including the fossil fuel industry, to abandon some of Canada's core climate policies. For reasons that I understand politically, the consumer carbon tax, of course, was dropped. But now there's signs that the electrical vehicle mandate is also in question. It was supposed to be in next year that the government of Canada was going to require that at least 20% of all vehicles in Canada would not be fossil fuel driven vehicles. That's now being put on hold, at least temporarily. This may not be a permanent decision at all. We'll have to wait and see, but it's not a good sign that it's on hold. The federal government needs to bring back the financial assistance that was available to people who wanted to buy electric vehicles and low emission vehicles. And the provincial government, of course, should be providing support for this as well, just like British Columbia and Quebec have been doing. But of course it's not. In fact, the province of Saskatchewan taxes people every year on their electric vehicles, which I think is just foolishness. But you know, there's obviously other important things that the federal government could be doing. One of them is that I would like to see the federal government refer the Saskatchewan First Act to the Supreme Court of Canada for a decision about whether that act is constitutional or not. For those of you who might not be familiar with this, the Saskatchewan government has passed legislation in which it says that it has the exclusive authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in the oil sector, the natural gas sector, the forestry sector, the electricity generation sector. It's saying that the government of Canada has no role at all to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in those sectors. And I think that's a very questionable piece of legislation that should be challenged by the government of Canada with a reference case to the Supreme Court. But so far, the federal government has not acted on that at all. So Alberta's done the same thing with its legislation, and it's not being challenged by Ottawa. That's not a good sign in terms of federal climate policy, because Saskatchewan and Alberta account for 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And if this legislation is not challenged, there's no prospect that Canada will meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, because the Alberta and Saskatchewan government won't allow that to be the case. They're dragging their feet when it comes to climate policy in a very dangerous way. So I think another thing I'd really like to see Ottawa do is, you know, some practical things that it clearly has absolute regulatory authority to do. It regulates the railways. There's no reason why it couldn't say that passenger rail gets more priority than it currently does now on Canada's tracks, and that passenger rail trains could actually run on time, which would greatly increase the number of people who would be willing to travel by rail. You know, that's just an example of what Ottawa has clear authority to do if it chose to. So there's an important role, obviously, for the federal government, and it's made commitments to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions 40 to 45% by 2030. And the Climate Institute has just warned Canadians that Ottawa is not on track to do that at all. So far, our emissions have only come down 8.5% compared to where they were in 2005, and there's a long way to go to get 40% below 2005 levels, which is what we promised the international community we would do. Saskatchewan's obviously, you know, we account for about 10% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And our emissions in this province are 9 times the world average and 3.5 times the Canadian average. You know, our emissions last year were 73.8 million tons. And that works out to about 61 tons per capita. And the global average is about 6.5 tons per capita. So you can see that we're way out of line. And I think, by the way, that estimate is low, because it presumes unrealistic reductions of methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. One of the things that the province of Saskatchewan has been saying now for the last several years is that, well, we've made headway in terms of reducing methane emissions from the extraction of oil and gas. And the province has made some headway. By the way, only because the federal government pushed them hard. The federal government passed its own regulations about methane reduction in Canada in the oil and gas sector, and then gave the provinces the option of coming up with equivalent plans. And Saskatchewan did that and took credit for its emission reduction. But the problem there is that methane emissions are not being accurately measured by the Saskatchewan government. And so its claimed reductions, while they're real, don't represent the real methane problem that we face in the oil and gas sector. For instance, a team from Carleton University went out to our heavy oil wells in the Lloydminster area and took real readings at each well, and found that the heavy oil industry was reporting emissions that were in fact 4 times higher than what they reported. In other words, the real emissions, when they measured them, to be precise, were 3.9 times higher than what industry was reporting. So of course the Saskatchewan government is using those industry figures, and therefore its methane numbers are inaccurate. And the problem is worse than is being reported, and that 73.8 million tons is probably closer to 80 million tons. So we've got a real problem with greenhouse gas emissions in this province, and we're not even fully acknowledging to the public and the federal government what the extent of the problem. That's just one example. At any rate, what can we do in this province? Well, one thing, of course, that the government should be doing, and that all political parties should be calling for who are not in government, but unfortunately we're not seeing this from the official opposition right now either, is that the first thing we should do is restore the industrial price on carbon. On April 1st, the government of Saskatchewan decided that it was no longer going to comply with federal law and charge industrial polluters a price on their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's over $400 million now that Saskatchewan taxpayers will have to pick up, because heavy industry in this province is not paying that bill anymore. They're not paying a price on carbon that is required under federal law. And again, the federal government is not challenging Saskatchewan on this, at least not yet. And that's very disappointing to see. Every other province is complying with this federal law. It's only Saskatchewan that is not. Similarly, it's the government of Saskatchewan, as many of you will know, has decided that it's going to refurbish Saskatchewan's coal-fired power plants and keep them running probably into the 2040s. The Saskatchewan Environmental Society and three individuals, including three individuals, one in Saskatoon, one in Regina, one in Manitoba, have added their names to that court case, along with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society and a group in Ottawa called Citizens for Public Justice. And Glenn Wright, who's here tonight, has very generously providing his legal services at no charge to the Environmental Society and the other groups in order to undertake this case. But we're challenging the right of the government of Saskatchewan to keep coal running in violation of federal law and in violation of Canada's commitments under the Paris Agreement. And obviously, coal, quite apart from its greenhouse gas emission impacts, is a dirty fuel. There's the problems associated with mercury pollution, the problems associated with particulate matter pollution, sulfur dioxide pollution, just as examples. So coal is something that urgently needs to be phased out in this province. Again, Alberta phased out their coal-fired power plants last year. Ontario did it in 2014. Nova Scotia is planning to comply with federal law by 2030. It's only Saskatchewan that is insisting on taking a different path and basically attempting to unravel Canada's climate change plan while it does it. And the federal government simply shouldn't allow Saskatchewan to get away with this. So, well, what are some other things that we ought to be doing in this province? One of them is taking electricity conservation a lot more seriously. If we're going to phase out coal-fired power plants, one of the things that we can do is copy states like Vermont and California that have had really aggressive electricity conservation plans. Per capita electricity consumption in California hasn't risen for the last 40 years. In Vermont, Vermont doesn't have a very efficient electricity delivery system. Their population is smaller than ours. They have 21 utilities, if you can imagine. But they all get together to deliver a really aggressive electricity conservation program. Why do they do it? Because building new electricity generation is expensive. Conserving electricity is a lot cheaper for both consumers and utilities who are trying to make more money. Yet SaskPower has not pursued what has been obvious to the people of Vermont. Efficiency Vermont is a very popular program by consumers in that state, and it saved consumers a lot of money. And we could be doing the same thing in Saskatchewan through Saskatchewan Power Corporation, and we failed to deliver. Most of our electricity in this province, close to well over 60%, is being consumed by about 150 companies, who, by the way, are being charged an electricity rate that is only half of what each of us pay for our electricity. Well, it's time that those companies paid a little more, and it's time that the pressure was put on them to invest seriously in electricity efficiency. And all kinds of incentive programs to make that happen are possible. Vermont, all SaskPower has to do is look at Vermont's programs and copy them, and they'd make significant headway. I think we could achieve 400 megawatts of electricity saving in this province over a period of 10 years. And just to put that in context, we have a grid with about 5,500 megawatts of electricity on it. You know, I look at what the Germans have done. The Germans have, in an area half the size of Saskatchewan, you've got 80 million people living in Germany, in a geographical area just half the size of our province. They have a solar resource that is maybe 2/3 as good as ours. You know, for every megawatt hour of electricity that we can produce, the Germans are probably producing about 2/3 of that. And yet the Germans managed to get 14% of all their electricity that they consume from solar power. The Germans don't have a wind resource that's as good as ours, but they get 33% of all the electricity they consume from wind power. So if they can do it for 80 million people in an area half the size of Saskatchewan, surely we can achieve those same numbers, 14% for solar, 33% for wind, in this province with 1.2 million people. I don't think it's too much to expect of our government. And obviously we need to have other sources of electricity, for base load when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining. I think one of the things, and again, this, you know, one can debate this, but I would like to have seen the provincial government, instead of continuing to expand natural gas-fired generation stations and maintaining coal, I would have liked to see the government invest more in cogeneration of electricity at new industrial facilities, where you can simultaneously burn natural gas for both industrial heat and electricity at the same time. That's what we do at the Corey Potash mine. It's a SaskPower facility that was originally set up with ATCO, but it supplies and it delivers about 226 megawatts of cogeneration. It can simultaneously supply the needs of the potash mine for industrial heat and generate electricity at the same time by burning natural gas. You know, this is not something we can do indefinitely because we need to move towards net zero emissions in this province. But in terms of replacing coal, that would be, you know, in addition to wind and solar, a way of moving more aggressively in that direction. We need to shut our coal-fired power plants down as quickly as we can. And so that's one of the suggestions that I'm making. I'd really also like to see the provincial government, you know, doing the kind of things, for instance, that Okotoks did in Alberta, but across different cities in Saskatchewan, developing model subdivision designs, working with the cities to, for instance, establish a solar subdivision in Saskatoon, in Regina, in Moose Jaw, in Prince Albert, with net zero energy, building construction, give companies, local companies in all those cities an opportunity to learn how to build net zero houses and heat them and provide the electricity needs and the supplementary heating needs with solar, and encourage net metering on a very extensive basis. As you know, the government has done exactly the opposite. They've weakened the net metering program in this province by essentially saying that if you're exporting electricity onto the grid and you have solar in your house, you only get paid half the retail rate instead of the full retail rate. And that slowed the adoption of solar down in this province very significantly. You know, the city of Saskatoon has been saying the grid is so dirty, we can't electrify the bus fleet in the city. Just as an example of the consequences that come with a dirty grid, I think many people are saying, what's the point in having an electric vehicle if the grid is so dirty? There are some benefits to still having an electric vehicle, but those benefits would be much greater if the grid was clean. You know, one of the things that I think the city of Saskatoon could do, by the way, is build their own solar facilities and charge their bus fleet with their own solar installations. And the city of Saskatoon should be negotiating with the provincial government to be allowed to develop solar facilities beyond the Saskatoon Light and Power District. Right now, the city is restricted to only be able to put solar in any neighborhood that was built before 1958. And this is just ridiculous. You know, the city should be allowed to put solar in any part of the city of Saskatoon and should negotiate with SaskPower in that regard, and should negotiate publicly to embarrass the province into capitulating on this issue. Well, there are obviously a whole bunch of other things that, you know, provincially we could do, but I want to leave lots of time for discussion and questions. And so I'm going to just say in closing that, you know, we clearly need to drive our greenhouse gas emissions down very aggressively in this province. We need fundamental changes in provincial policy. There's a dozen others that I could have talked about tonight, but won't, so that we have time for discussion. But you know, every 1/10 of a degree above the 1.5 degrees Celsius matters a lot in terms of climate breakdown and how serious climate breakdown will be. Every 1/10 of a degree matters, and the World Meteorological Organization keeps trying to emphasize that to every government in the world. So it's never too late to take action, but if we delay any longer, the consequences just become more and more serious. So I think above all of the three issues that we're addressing tonight, I think that the climate emergency is the most urgent. But each one of these is a risk to the future of humanity, and all three need serious attention from our provincial government, our federal government. And of course, if Saskatchewan and Canada aren't hitting their own targets, we're in a very weak position to suggest to other countries in the world that they should take their climate change targets seriously. So it's important that we set a good example, and right now, Saskatchewan is setting a very bad one. Thanks so much for your attention and coming tonight, and we'll open it up for discussion.